So Craig, tell everyone a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I'm a clinical psychologist with the National Center for Veteran Studies at the University of Utah. I previously served on active duty in the military, and then separated from military service, went into academia and research since, and recently largely focused on developing treatments, interventions, reviews, and protection methods for suicidal behaviors, especially amongst military personnel.
And you are a veteran yourself.
Yes.
And so this is not an abstract issue for you.
Right. Yeah. So, what I like to kind of explain to people, sort of, when they say, how did you get involved in suicide prevention? It was sort of an academic interest of mine for many years. I can think all the way back to graduate school, being interested in suicide and PTSD. And I joined the military, and it was while I was deployed to Iraq that really sort of the real sort of significance of the issue became very real to me. And it was because, while I was deployed, I came into contact with service members who had died by suicide. I was, standing over their dead bodies and, talking with guys suffering with trauma. And, here in the States, when you work with guys with PTSD, this thing that happened to them was like months or usually years ago. But when you're deployed to a combat zone, this thing that happened was maybe 1 hour ago or 2 hours ago, and they're still receiving medical care. And, in some cases, they're not able to speak because their lips have been melted together. And it was a very different experience for me as a psychologist, and it really helped me to understand the gravity of the situation when it comes to mental illness as well as suicide in military personnel.
With that gravity in mind, tell people a little bit about what led to the micropatterns study.
Sure. So, I would say one of the biggest knowledge gaps in suicide prevention is related to the concept of the warning sign. And if you think of, when we talk about a warning sign, we usually have things for like heart attack or stroke. And the whole idea is that these are observable, reasonably objective indicators of an imminent or near-term outcome of some sort. And the ideal warning sign is not only useful as a short-term indicator of the outcome, but it's also preferably something that is fairly easy, discrete to measure. It's quantifiable, and it can be observed by someone outside of the condition. And so that's why when you think of warning signs for like a heart attack or something, it's pain in the chest, it's sweating, pain radiating down the left side of the body in particular. And if someone were to verbally state, hey, I'm having these pains, it's really uncomfortable, I'm sweating a lot, even an outsider would be able to say, well, that's an objective indicator. We wouldn't necessarily have to make any inferences about what the person feels or what they're thinking inside of their head. And so if you kind of think of that as a concept, the warning signs, and now apply it to the issue of suicide, we really don't have any. Now you can,
but we tell everyone we do, right? And that they should know them.
Yeah, and
but that's really not true.
Yeah, and so as an exercise, there was a paper published in 2006 by David Rudd and Mike Mandrusiak and a few others. But what they did is just a very simple study. They just Googled the terms suicide warning sign. You can do this yourself. And, I think they got hundreds of thousands of hits, and they took a random selection of, I think, the first 10,000 sites listed on Google, and went through and actually coded what were the warning signs listed on these websites. And what they found was that there was absolutely no consistency whatsoever. And so if you want to know what the so-called warning signs for suicide are, it simply just depends on what link appears first on your Google search. And that's a problem because there's no consistency in public education. There's no way for family members, friends, coworkers, others to actually know what are the signs that differentiate suicidal behavior in the near term. And part of the reason we don't have better information about this is we just don't have scientific data. When you ask,
but you do.
well, we have some, and I'm of course hedging my bets because I think we need to replicate findings, and we need additional data to really make sure that we're right, and it wasn't just sort of a fluke finding a type 1 error in our one study that we did. But this is I think one of the biggest problems, because we want to know when is a person heading towards suicide and when are they not. And right now, if everyone in that room were to try to list what they think suicide warning signs are, they would probably, if you would come with things like depression, hopelessness, suicidal thinking, giving away one's prized possessions. These are kind of the typical things that people come up with. The problem is they have very, very low specificity. So many people who are depressed do not kill themselves. Many people who break up or have a divorce do not kill themselves. And so what we think are warning signs are actually risk factors. And so the reason I'm kind of taking this long approach to answering this question is, what we started thinking was that if we are going to really start to identify warning signs for suicide, we really have to shrink the time horizon down to units that are actually meaningful to family members and clinicians. We also have to get out of this tendency that we have to use emotional states and making inferences about a person's internal psychological state. And we need much more objective, observable, discrete, quantifiable behaviors. So if we are going to shrink that window and move to observable behaviors, we're also going to have to get out of the healthcare system, because most people don't visit a mental health professional or any other healthcare provider in the time immediately before their death. And even when we do visit healthcare providers, it's usually during time horizons that are not short enough for us to actually see, well, why is a person going to kill themselves tomorrow as opposed to today? If you only visit the doctor once a month or once a week, that might not be a high enough frequency to actually see the behavior of interest.
And for VA data, a lot of folks who die by suicide in VA, like, they are seen and they are screened, and they deny being suicidal, right, and they may not have been in that moment.
Right. And yeah, so I mean, the traditional classic approach to screening of risk is to ask someone, are you thinking about killing yourself? But there are studies now internationally across clinical and non-clinical samples that show that anywhere from 50% to 2/3 of individuals who die by suicide say, I'm not going to kill myself, the last time they were screened right before they killed themselves. And so asking someone about suicide ideation is definitely important, but right now it's sort of like we hang our hat on that only, and it's not very good. It's sometimes helpful if someone answers yes, it does seem to predict risk. However, if a person says no, it doesn't seem to predict much at all. So it has a high false negative rate, basically. And so this is where we got into the realm of social media data. People will use social media, they communicate their inner thoughts, their feelings, their actions, their behaviors, their life situations. And because they are communicating it in a public forum, this is a discrete, quantifiable, observable, objective behavior. And you can post on social media very frequently. There's really no limit. I guess the limit is just how quickly you can type. And so you could potentially have someone posting multiple times per day, regardless of their healthcare utilization. And so this sort of solves the problem that many of us have really been looking at when it comes to this notion of short-term imminent indicators of risk. We could potentially capture people even though they're not going to the doctor, because they're telling the world, they're telling their friends and family members, and maybe even beyond that, what their inner thoughts are and their inner feelings. And there might be certain patterns that can be detected during different time frames, which could signal the emergence of suicidal behavior. And in essence, that was what we found in our sort of, I really say, I think it's a pilot project. It was a proof of concept that we wanted to move as well beyond a checklist of warning signs of here's a list of 10 things and look out for them, because that doesn't work and it's useless from a public education perspective. But we were really interested in also modeling the concept of change in time. And so we actually started looking and basing our work off of dynamic systems theory, which assumes that the change process is nonlinear in nature. And so we have to get out of linear regression models and drawing all these nice little straight, pretty, lines that kind of are the average between all of these data points, which we have traditionally looked at as error variance. And we looked at it from, well, maybe that's not the error variance, maybe that's the signal. And we should allow the data to move in nonlinear manners. And what we found is when we did that, we were able to significantly improve our ability to detect those who are on the trajectory towards suicide. And we were able to even estimate how close to death were they.
Can you give the folks in the room is that okay? An overview of what you found, like what was the trajectory looking like?
Yeah, so what we did was we collapsed the data. So the students who were coding the data were looking for 36 different variables or constructs, and they would go through and just go line by line through the social media posts and then just code yes or no, is that particular variable present within the content. And then what we did is we took those 36 variables and we collapsed them into 5 variables that align with our conceptual model of suicide. And so it's things like life stressors, cognitions and thoughts, emotions, physical symptoms or somatic complaints, and then behaviors and actions. And part of the reason we did that was not only to take all these millions of data points down to something that was a little easier to model for us. But we were also very interested in approaching this from a public education perspective where, for example, we had 3 different codes where things like hopelessness, perceived burdensomeness, self-hatred, shame, like these are all different cognitive states. And although the scientific literature, the clinical scientific literature would say these are very different thought processes, but they're correlated with each other. The typical mom or dad or significant other non-psychologist doesn't necessarily understand the difference between and the nuance and the shades of all these different thought processes. However, they can look at all of those 4 different types of thought processes, and most of them will agree that's a negative thought process. And so that was kind of the approach that we took, is what's a negative thought process, a negative emotion. And so we looked at the 12 months before service members died by suicide. We had a group who had died of suicide, a group who had died of other non-suicide causes. And we looked at these nonlinear coupling relationships amongst these 5 different variables. One of the significant signatures that really emerged in the data were that those who died by suicide tended to get into this. I'm starting to describe it now in the paper. We describe it as a downward spiral of thoughts and stressors. And so on social media, they would typically talk about something bad in their life, an argument with someone else, or a bad day at work, or financial, unexpected bill, or something like that. And then immediately afterwards, within the next day, they would start talking about how hopeless they were, how life sucks, this isn't fair, I can't take this anymore. They would start to describe negative emotions like stress or anger, depression, sadness. And then very soon after that, within the next day, they started talking about stressful life events again. And then right after that, they would start talking about more negative thoughts and feelings. And it was like this pattern just continued of going back and forth between, bad things are happening and now I'm feeling and thinking bad things. And it was almost like they were sort of stuck in this vicious cycle, and they couldn't free themselves from this downward spiral. And this pattern, this back and forth, strengthened as they got closer and closer to death, and so it became much more pronounced. And that was one of the signatures we were able to identify as this might be a clue as to not only are they on the trajectory towards suicide, but depending on the magnitude or the strength of the effect, it might give us some clues as to, are they 6 months away from suicide? Are they 1 month? Or is this like, within the next few days that they're probably going to be acting? Another pattern, another key pattern that we found, it was a weaker pattern, but it was there, and we think it was really important. But we found that in the month before a person killed themselves, they had another unique signature that emerged. And what this particular signature found was that suicidal individuals would constantly express these negative thoughts about themselves and the world, but about a month before they started, or a month before they died, they would also start talking a lot about maladaptive behaviors, typically alcohol abuse or social withdrawal. And what was interesting is that if they would post something about one of these maladaptive behaviors, they would no longer post negative thoughts. So up until a month before they die, it's life sucks, it's never gonna get any better, I hate myself, I'm a failure, et cetera, et cetera. Then about a month before they die, they start saying, I'm gonna go out drinking tonight, I'm gonna go, I got into a fight, I was being reckless. And then they stop talking about how horrible they are, how hopeless life is. And that particular pattern got stronger and stronger as we went from a month to a week, and then even a day before the person died by suicide. We have some ideas on why we think we see these particular signals, but the other kind of interesting finding was that that sort of imminent pattern for suicide had what's referred to as an anti-phase relationship. So we're looking at synchrony and phase versus anti-phase patterns as well. And in-phase pattern is one goes up, the other goes up, one goes down, the other goes down. So it's kind of this up and down link cycle. And anti-phase is they're negatively correlated. One goes up and the other goes down. And what was very fascinating was that imminent indicator of maladaptive patterns followed by a decrease in negative thoughts and feelings. That was the only anti-phase coupling relationship that we found in the data. And so we thought, even though it was relatively weak pattern as compared to several of the others that we found, it was so unique to suicide within the next month that we think that could potentially be a warning sign for suicide. The last thing I'll note about it that I think is very critical, the reason why we've been looking at these sort of coupling relationships is that what our findings suggest is that it's not any particular risk factor in and of itself or any particular variable, but it's the temporal sequencing of variables within close proximity that might actually signal emerging risk. So it's not drinking by itself that's a risk factor for suicide, but when a person talks about drinking and they're drinking more than usual, and then they stop engaging in another risk factor or another pattern, that particular combination of two different risk variables, suddenly that signals suicide in a much stronger way than either of those variables by themselves.
And this is a very new way to think about predicting suicide. So for our field, maybe not for you all, like for some of the folks who are the non-suicide experts in the room. So these folks have got a big data set to work on today that is full of clinical data. If you were them and in their place, like what would be interesting to you about this huge set of like synthesized clinical data?
Yeah, so I've fully drunk the Kool-Aid on systems thinking, and it's because one of my primary collaborators at Utah is John Butner. He is a dynamic systems theorist, mathematician. This is all he does is think. And he and I just sit down and just have been trying to apply the math to the problem of suicide, and because because this sort of dynamic systems approach has not been applied to suicide at all, in many ways the sky's the limit. But if I had access to a data set like that, that's sort of the mindset I would be approaching, where, we've very clearly the old ways of doing regression analysis and, multi-level models and all that kind of stuff, linear patterns, is insufficient. And so I wouldn't be doing anything related to that. And so I would be very interested in looking at oscillatory patterns, complex coupling amongst multiple variables at once, because I'm now very strongly convinced that it's not any single variable, but it will be the time signature that occurs amongst multiple variables during certain discrete periods of times that will probably be where the signal emerges.
That is really helpful. The audience is starting to have some questions, so someone brought me one, and so I'm going to start with him. But is it okay if I give you guys a chance to, we're getting Craig from Spain. He's doing us a favor. This is your shot. So Simpson, if you want to chat with him.
So several times it's been mentioned that destroy the data when you were finished with the study, and I'm confused about that because I used to be on an IRB in the Navy. And we had a policy requiring data archiving for 30 years of all human subject data following the conclusion of the experiment. Now, that was from Don CIO, and it sounds like this was funded by Army, but that's a really different policy. So could you speak to that?
Yeah, it was related to the astronomically unprecedented high levels of fear and paranoia related to using social media data. It took us years to get through not just IRB review, but also the privacy office and then general counsel. And I mean, everyone was involved because everyone was worried and scared about this. And in essence, in many ways, the data were never really handed to us. We did receive de-identified data, but the government remained the data owners. And so all the agreements from the start were, you're going to answer this question, and when you're done answering the question, that's it.
So you didn't do this within the government, you did this outside the government?
Yeah, so the government...
So could you just describe the whole data flow and regulatory process?
Yeah, so we worked with Perserec and DMDC. They were the ones who were able to pull a lot of the personnel files. They pulled the mortality data, all those sorts of things. And because, again, the concern, I've been funded by the DoD for years now, doing all sorts of data. We collect social security numbers, because it's medical research. But for this particular project, and I wasn't involved in the conversations. It was happening on the government side. It's just like, we're not releasing any of this information to an external agency. And so a lot of that happened on the government side, and then eventually I was given the scrubbed de-identified data set that was linked to the social media data.
But the social media can't be de-identified, so
there was a private company, and kind of the background of this is that there was a company, Social Intelligence, who works for the government and does security clearance reviews. So they're the ones, every 7 years you got to get your security clearance. They scrub the internet for social media, for police mugshots, all that kind of stuff, all your micro blogs, and then they are able to aggregate that data and provide it back to the government, as a part of that review process. And during just their routine operations, they were noticing, their technicians are noticing, people express very severe problems on social media. And there was one particular case, as it was explained to me, where a technician at this company was like, this person's not doing well. I think we need to report this, for a mental health reason. And so they forwarded the information onto the government and said, it's not a security issue, but this is just screaming, this person needs help. And when they heard back from the government, and they said, the person just actually killed themselves like 2 days ago. And that was, they had, I think, 2 or 3 cases that happen like that. And that's where the government and this agency came together and said, we need to be doing research on this because it was so obvious to everyone involved. And then they started working the wheels and then figure out who we're going to pull in to help us out, who's going to be our suicide guy. And then I got a cold call out of nowhere and saying, would you be interested in doing something like this? And I said, hell yes, I would. Are you kidding me? This is exactly what we need to be doing. And so for that initial project, I was not as closely involved because I suspect they didn't really know who I was and probably didn't want to give me the keys to the prize just yet.
Okay.
Other questions?
Thank you.
I just want a clarification. They said DMDC, Defense Manpower Data Center.
Yeah.
Can you come to the camera?
That's the question.
So it was
Defense
asked about
Manpower Data
DMDC,
Center.
which is Defense Manpower Data Center, and PERSIREC, which is the organization in Monterey, which is responsible for coming up with the scientific standards for adjudicating security clearances.
Other folks who have questions before we hand the floor to David and we thank Dr. Bryan for his time. Other questions? Make sure no. Yes, Mr. Dr. Sullivan.
So look here.
Oh.
We can totally pass it. There we go.
Craig, good morning. Thank you for your work here and thank you for giving up your time. I know you're 5 hours ahead of us, so it's the middle of the night there in Spain. I have two questions. One is you referenced several maladaptive behaviors that you'd identified, drinking, fighting. Are there others? Or I know those were just examples, but are there others that you saw as part of this? And do you think, and this might be more speculative, but this was information gleaned from social media. What you're thinking on, is that the same kind of information that someone's likely to share in a session with their clinician or a group or other non-media interface?
Right.
I'm going to keep looking.
Yeah. So the core behavior, we looked at several. So there's violence, aggression, alcohol use, drug use, prescription drug use or medication use. And we required there that it wasn't just that they were taking medicine and saying I took my meds, but there had to be some sort of clear indication that they were taking more medications than they should have been. And social withdrawal. So this was usually things like, people expressing, I'm not going to go out to that party after all. I decided not to go to the lunch meeting, something like that. I want to say we looked at maybe one or two more, but it was alcohol use was the by far the most common, and then social withdrawal of some form, and then there was some cases of violence and aggression. So I would be very interested if we had a larger data set, are those different types of behaviors, do they hold different amounts of information? Or are there different circumstances under which they might yield different signals or different information? And so that's something that I would be very interested in looking at in the future. I do think some of this could be reflected in the medical record, and it really kind of depends on what the medical record looks like, how it's structured, and how the clinicians practice. So I'm an enormous advocate, at least on the mental health clinician side, of routine monitoring of patient outcomes. So every time the patient comes in for a therapy session, you fill out a symptom checklist, and then those scores go into the medical record. Unfortunately, that is not often a practice. However, I think if you're using medical records, especially for something like coming from a government agency like the VA, it's very common to use like the PHQ-9 and other very simple, brief measures. And those are oftentimes entered into the medical record. A colleague of mine, Chris Poulin, when he was running the Durkheim project, he did this using natural language processing on unstructured VA medical records. And what he found was that it was the content of the clinician notes. So what the doctors and the nurses actually said as they were documenting care, that also provided some signals. And in some cases, there was information about alcohol use, other behaviors. His signal, the word that was the single best discriminant of suicide versus non-suicides in both psychiatric controls and non-psychiatric controls was agitation, which again, this was another case even before this other social media project I just talked about. This was like 7 years ago. Got a cold call from Chris and his team out at Dartmouth, who was looking for a suicide expert, and because they had found this, and they're like, we don't know what to do with the data. Like, what does this mean? And I was on the phone with them. I said, agitation is one of the variables that we think is probably the strongest signal. In essence, you just reverse engineered about 10 years worth of clinical research. And so I do think that you could possibly find very important information in the medical record, both that the patient is generating and that is being entered into the data, as well as what the doctors and the clinicians and the healthcare providers are generating about their impressions, or at least the report of the patient.
And not only for clinicians, but as you pointed out earlier, so many people don't present to the healthcare system that are struggling with these issues. As we work to remove stigma of mental health issues and get peers involved, family members, friends, coworkers, the people that you might be interfacing with on social media, to get that message out there to say, hey, this is my buddy John. I'm not a clinician, I'm just John's friend, but this seems to be something I need to be paying attention to right now because there's been this shift.
Right, absolutely. And I think, one of the things I'm starting to learn as I, continue to work in this space, there are different groups doing, or at least approaching it in different ways. And my guess is in the room that this is reflected. There are probably the NLP individuals. There's probably the dynamic systems thinkers. There's someone like me who's a clinician, I think, in terms of medical records. That we've done some work looking at the content of pictures, and maybe you saw the press release a couple of weeks ago that one of the teams found that those with major depression on Instagram, they tend to post more black and white images than full color images. And so there are all these different sort of perspectives and different people touching different parts of the elephant. And so I think social media and medical records are the same thing. They reflect different sources of information. And my very strong interest is how do we take these different approaches and different perspectives and integrate them? Because my guess is that they all will have strengths that will complement each other and give us an even stronger signal than any one of them by themselves.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Other questions?
I have a question.
We'll do this and then we'll do Sean. How about that? Where the computer is.
Hi, thanks for talking with us today. I had a question about what you were talking about earlier and the various patterns in data, and you mentioned that in some cases people almost display, in that 1 month period before suicide, seemingly sort of more positive symptoms and talking about, going out with friends and drinking and being more social as opposed to negative thoughts. Could you describe from a clinical perspective any hypotheses you might have about why that's the case for some people?
Yeah. So one of the areas of research that I've been focused on, we've published 2 papers on this now. Actually, just on the flight over here to Spain, was working on another data analysis and found a very similar, consistent trend in a different sample. But suicide, a really nice way to think about why do people kill themselves is to look at a learning model. And when I say learning model, this is reinforcement and punishment. This is potty training your dog, teaching your kids how to do something, where you engage in the behavior and you give a cookie afterwards. Or in some cases, for negative reinforcement, you're experiencing something uncomfortable, and then you engage in a behavior and the uncomfortable thing stops, right? So that negative reinforcement schedule we have found is a primary motive for suicidal behavior. We found that after a person attempts suicide, if they experience a reduction in emotional distress afterwards, they're more likely to attempt suicide again. And we've also found in our newer research that those who have never attempted suicide before are less strongly motivated by this negative reinforcement than those for whom it has proven to work in the past. Well, when you look at the research on other maladaptive behavioral patterns like alcohol use in particular, but also you just see reckless behavior, sensation seeking types of stuff, you often see that these other maladaptive patterns function in the same way. They numb the pain, or they get rid of emotional distress, or I stop going out and hanging out with friends because I'm so self-critical. They're thinking bad things about me. I feel uncomfortable. So if I just don't go, I don't have to deal with it. And so the reason why we think in the final month that we saw this kind of unique pattern is this negative reinforcement. That's my hypothesis. I don't know for sure, but that seems to be why it would. Why is it then right before a person kills themselves? Why would they start, or why would they stop talking about all these horrible things about themselves and all their negative feelings? I think it's because they're starting to amp up their maladaptive behaviors, and it's reducing their emotional distress in the short term, and that's manifest on their social media profiles.
Excellent question. We're going to do one more, and then David needs it back, right?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Sean?
Hey, Craig. Sean Han, I'm the director of the state's Veterans Mental Health Program in Texas. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Military Veteran Peer Network, but we have 37 coordinators embedded in our state's mental health system, but their job is out in the field. So you wanted to find out, what is it that I can go home and operationalize now? What do I need to incorporate into our peer training? What do I need to direct those coordinators to do? So from everything that we've learned, how can I better what we're doing in the field?
Yeah. What I usually recommend here is that people recognize that social media networks is an alternative form of communication. And so whether it's a peer network or even families, friends, coworkers, whomever, recognize that people might be expressing something online. And because of it's sort of interesting, it's not really anonymous when you post on social media. I mean, obviously, you have sometimes hundreds of people whom you have given permission to observe what you're saying and what you're thinking. There's still something about the fact that those hundreds of people aren't sitting there right in front of you, that maybe I'll express or communicate something that I otherwise wouldn't be willing to disclose. And so I think your peers would find it beneficial to pay attention to social media. Now, I always give this warning, this caveat. This doesn't mean that your peers or in the military, the NCOs or the senior NCOs, their job is to now become Big Brother, and you have to like every single person in your community, and it's your job to be, the sole social media review person. No, that's ridiculous. And I don't encourage peer specialists or anyone else to make it a habit to start trolling and stalking people on social media because you're trying to prevent something bad from happening. I would say see this instead as another form of communication. So if you are already connected with people on social media and you happen to see something during your daily Facebook newsfeed review, know that might be something. If someone's expressing these negative thoughts and you notice, man, they've been really stressed out, they've talked about all these bad things, and now they're really hopeless and saying how angry they are, and they keep kind of going back and forth between these stressors and these negative psychological states, then reach out. Say, how are you doing? Is there something I can do to help? And likewise, for family members, if family members notice this process, they might be reaching out to the peer supporters and saying, hey, I'm worried about my spouse, I'm worried about my kid, something like that. And I think being willing when people say, they said such and such on social media, to not just dismiss it offhand and say, well, I mean, it's social media. It's not like they said it to your face. And I think there's some subgroups who find it easy to write off social media because, well, I asked them face to face and they said no. So they must be okay. Well, they might be okay, or maybe they didn't feel comfortable talking with you and honestly disclosing what they're thinking and feeling.
Great. Thanks, Craig.
Craig, before I hand this back to David, you have a lot of information and we don't have all day, sadly. How can people find you later?
Probably the best way is email. So craig.bryan@utah.edu.
Why?
Yeah, Bryan with a Y. So that's the easiest way to communicate with me since I travel so much, but I tend to stay on top of email fairly regularly. So.
And I'll make sure to share that. Thank you so much for your time. Have a lovely trip. Please say hi to Annabelle, Rich McKean if you see him, and all the gang.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. And let me just say thank you so much, Craig. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Take care.